Picture this. A packed dance floor bass shaking the room, strobe lights cutting through the crowd, drinks pouring, the city's elite mixing, and the excitement at an event that wasn't simply a party, but a war zone of emotions, drama, and raw tension. All-time high. But in the midst of all this turmoil, Kirk Frost and young Jock entered the scene with a serious agenda, and their target, Lil Scrappy, a man whose magnetic presence could light up any room. It began slowly. Iced steps, whispered. Remarks, a storm building beneath the surface, and then everything exploded. The atmosphere changed abruptly. Words became sharp, and the dance floor's center abruptly turned into a battleground. Phones sprang up, recording every second, and some people froze too much too. The entire club was on edge as a result of this intense altercation. But what made Kirk and Jock confront Scrappy so bravely? And how far did it go before security had to intervene? The night had only just started, but within that Atlanta, with booming music, flashing lights, and a throng that kept rising, the nightclub's energy was already electric and the kind of night that people talk about for weeks. The queue outside went around the block and was crowded with the most fashionable and connected individuals in the city. The dance floor was alive with strobe lights that flared and sank with the pounding bass, giving glimpses of faces engrossed in the music at the bar groups hunched over glasses, shouting to be heard over the deafening noise. If you had status, this was the place to be. People were in their zone everywhere you looked, but up in the VIP area, the atmosphere was different. Instead of celebrating, it was about something brewing beneath the surface. Kirk Frost and young Jock were seated at their own table. Jock's laughter felt forced, and Kirk's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but there was a tension between them that was undetectable to most but impossible to ignore despite the hordes of people swarming around them. They looked like the part designer, wore pricey liquor, and exuded success. Ignore those around them. They were too preoccupied with the benefits of being in the orbit of two well-known figures to notice or care. In another VIP booth, Lil Scrappy was the life of his own party, with Kirk and Jockey buried in thought. He wasn't just there, he owned the place. People drew toward him, glasses clinked, and every few minutes someone stopped by to pay their respects. Scrappy's laughter pierced through the music, his motions were fluid, and his charisma was apparent. Kind of man who made a routine night into something special. And tonight was no exception, but underneath the surface, things were changing. Kirk and Jack kept looking toward Scrappy's booth, subtly at first, a glance here, a whisper there. But as the minutes went by, it became clear that the air around them altered, and it became evident that Kirk leaned in and spoke in a low but intense voice. Jock's demeanor darkened whatever they were discussing. It wasn't simply casual discussion. A waitress bringing drinks halted, sensing the change, and her eyes darted between Kirk's. In the meantime, at Scrappy's table, the atmosphere remained, electric and unfazed. He proceeded toward the dance floor, stopping to greet a few familiar friends and raising his glass in acknowledgement if he felt the weight of his jack tightened as he moved closer to Kirk. "You see what I'm seeing?" he mumbled over the pounding bass. Kirk didn't immediately respond, his eyes fixed on Scrappy's every action, but at last he nodded. "Yeah," he said. Voice measured. "I see that there was a history here that most of the club didn't know about." The three men had been friends for years, attending the same events and hanging out in the same circles. Their interactions with outsiders appeared to be cordial enough, but behind the scenes it wasn't just about Scrappy. It was about what he stood for, his unwavering confidence and his capacity to attract attention. Scrappy's ascent, unfiltered confidence, and expanding influence had made him a favorite of many, but not of everyone. The DJ changed tracks, the dance floor erupted, the lights flashed faster, bodies moved tighter, and the club's intensity peaked when Kirk and Jock stood up. His movements, as if nothing could touch him, made a statement that some people didn't appreciate. Up, they started to push through the crowd without saying a word. They went directly for Scrappy, who was engrossed in the moment, nodding to fans who were chanting his name, raising his glass, and maintaining the energy. But the people, as they watched, the atmosphere changed around him, and then all of a sudden, it was too late for Scrappy to glance up. Kirk had stopped a few feet away, so he had his hands in his pockets, and the Jock had moved closer to the air. A heavy silence enveloped their space, dense with tension, as the music, flashlights, and distant laughter faded into the background. Scrappy dropped his drink slightly, his typical grin dimming, and his stance straightened as he assessed them. His tone was casual but careful as he inquired, "What's going on, guys?" His crew was stirred behind him, and a few of them stood up, their eyes darting between Kirk and the jock. No one spoke, but even the people watching them could sense the tension in the room. Kirk didn't respond immediately. Instead, he examined Scrappy, his face impassive, and then, at last, he said, "You've been running your mouth." His voice was low, even causing drama, and Scrappy's hand clenched over his glass as he arched an eyebrow. His comments were forceful, but something in his posture betrayed him. His eyes flickered toward his booth, where his staff was now fully attentive. They whispered among themselves, but no one moved. However, the typical confidence in his voice faltered. His body language was calm and controlled, but his eyes conveyed a different message. "If you have anything to say, we have plenty to say," he added, turning back to face them. Jock stepped forward, closing the last bit of distance between them. Scrappy didn't flinch. On the contrary, his posture hardened as his tone veered toward defiance, his free hand curling into a fist at his side. He took a step forward and was now standing. His voice was sharp enough to cut through the cacophony. "And if you're clever, you'll listen." The audience surrounding them moved when they were almost knee-to-toe with the jock. Some took a step back, while others leaned in, enticed by the threat of an explosion. At that point, the nightclub wasn't about the music, the drinks, or the party where Kirk was. The battlefield where Frost, Young Jock, and Lil Scrappy stood had completely changed. Scrappy's crew was anxious. Some were standing, while others were hanging close to the booth, their eyes darting between the three guys. Their whispers were hurried and swift, and no one wanted to make the first mistake. Jack spoke first, but everyone could see what was going to happen. He pointed the finger at Scrappy, saying, "You've been spreading lies for a long time, and you think you can run your mouth and not face the consequences. If I have something to say, I'll say it," Scrappy said, lifting his chin and his jack tightening. "Don't come at me with weak accusations unless you have something solid," he shouted back. And Kirk came closer, his expression icy cold. "We've got more than just words, Scrappy." "We have receipts," Kirk remarked, and with a swift swipe, he unlocked his phone and held up the screen. Scrappy squinted to attempt to see the details, but he didn't need to since the weight of Kirk's gesture said everything. His jaw tightened, so he added, "You're going to show me some out-of-context messages, that's your proof." He snorted and waved a contemptuous hand, but his voice wasn't as steady as it had been before. His attitude remained the same, though. Lily had undergone a minor alteration, the kind that only occurs when someone begins to sense the walls closing. Jock made another step and was now standing shoulder to shoulder with Kirk. This isn't out of context. Jock stated that his voice was sharper and lower now, and he was being solemn. When Scrappy's irritation reached a boiling point, he planted his feet, squared his shoulders, and met eyes with the two men you believe you can trust. "You've been playing both sides, saying one thing to us and another to everyone else." Then, he leaned in. "It's time to own up before this gets worse. Come on in here and push me." His voice broke through the cacophony, making it louder. "Who do you think you are?" Heads turned from neighboring tables, conversations quiet. The pulse of the nightclub continued to pound. The lights continued to flash, but in this small area, all focus was on them, and a small group of people were gathered at the edges, drawn in by the fire that was burning between them. Kirk didn't blink, and his voice was controlled and measured, but underneath, there was steel that was larger than you might have imagined. He leaned in just a little, and you kept running your mouth. Before continuing to push your luck, perhaps consider that it will affect not just you, but also everyone around you. The words came down hard, and Scrappy took a slow, deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides and his shoulder tense. "If you have something to say," his simmering voice, he added, "say it now because I'm done playing games." Behind him, his crew tightened their line and moved closer. They didn't say anything, but their presence was enough to create a loose semicircle and a wall of silent support. The jock grinned and shook his head. "Head, you've spoken too much already," he said. We're just here to make sure you know we're not letting it slide. Suddenly, Kirk moved forward until Scrappy could feel the heat of his breath. His voice faded almost completely under the music, but it was still audible. Sharp enough to cut through the tension, Kirk whispered, "Keep talking, and you'll see what happens next." Scrappy remained motionless and unblinking, his heart thumping, but his voice was firm. "You don't scare me," he muttered. "You never did." The room's mood changed once more, and Kirk's eyes narrowed, and his hands tightened as Scrappy's crew edged closer, their muscles clenched in preparation for whatever was about to happen. The crowd hardly breathed, only seconds away from exploding, but then a strong hand broke the tension and landed on Kirk's shoulder. "That's enough." A security guard with a large, calm, authoritative voice said, "Take it outside or take a seat." Kirk initially remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Scrappy, his expression unflinching. The jock took a step back, rolling his shoulders, but his posture remained the same. The security guy wasn't playing as stiff. Scrappy sighed and slowly relaxed his position, but the fire in his eyes never went out. He gestured toward their booths and muttered, "I don't care who you are," sounding like stone. For a brief moment, it appeared as though Kirk and the air was still heavy from everything that had been left unsaid. But Kirk put his phone back in his pocket and said, "We'll settle this another time." His voice was low enough for Scrappy to hear, and Jack gave Scrappy one last glance before turning. They moved back toward their VIP area, vanishing into the crowd. Scrappy didn't move immediately. His hands were still buzzing from the excitement, and his breath was still a touch heavy. A hand fell on his shoulder, one of his crew. "You're a nice man." Scrappy blinked, forcing himself to ease back into the moment. "I'm good." He picked up his drink, took a slow sip, and turned to face his booth. His voice was steady and calm, but there was a hint of tension below it. He let the words settle. However, as he sat down, the sensation in his stomach wouldn't go away. The way Kirk and Jock had approached him and looked at him wasn't the end. Rather, it was only the beginning. As the night wore on, the tension didn't go away. Instead, it thickened and settled into Kirk and Jock were back in their booth, but the atmosphere had changed. Their drinks were still there, and they were not talking to each other. They were no longer just two men having fun. Instead, they were watching and thinking about their next move. Scrappy tried to brush it off by leaning back in his booth with a drink in hand and a smirk on his lips, but his closest friends and family could see right through it. They kept their talks quiet, and their eyes darted to Kirk and Jockey. When the chatter began, what had been a private standoff became public information in record time, and everyone whispered about what they'd seen, embellishing every detail, like a storm that hung just overhead waiting to break every few minutes. A man at the opposite end of the room chuckled as he narrated his version of events, while a woman near the bar leaned close to her pals and spoke in a quiet but frantic voice. I believe Kirk and Jook were about to set it off with this close to swinging. Even though no fists had been thrown, the rumors took on a life of their own, and Scrappy put them down like a champion. Then the phones came out, and a shaky video that was only a few seconds long and captured footage from across the room appeared on social media. Showed little more than Kirk and the Jock standing in front of Scrappy. The moment's weight was heavy, but it was enough because a hashtag began trending minutes later. The club staff tried their best to keep the evening going, but they knew that this wasn't just back in VIP. Kirk checked his phone and clenched his jaw as he scrolled through the influx of comments. "They're talking like we're the bad guys," he said, his voice tense but quiet, after another celebrity feud in which their club had just been the focus of a viral moment. Angry as we began, the doctor looked at the screen and shook his head, saying, "It's just noise." However, after a moment, perhaps it's time to correct the record. Kirk nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. "Yeah," he said, putting his phone in his pocket. "We need to handle." While this was going on, Scrappy's group was watching the same firestorm play out on their screens across the club. One of his boys turned their phone to face him, smiling, and they said, "You're a legend, man," referring to you as the club's monarch. There was no amusement in Scrappy's brief laugh as his fingers hit his glass and his eyes darted toward Kirk and Jock's booth. "Yeah," he whispered. But we both know they're not done with this. He took a leisurely sip of his drink without taking his eyes off of it. They're just getting started as the club winded down. The excitement outside was just as powerful as it had been inside, and many stayed in the parking lot even after he put down the glass and clinked quietly. "You think this is over?" he sighed, shaking his head, buzzing, exchanging stories, and guessing that what had begun as a fight had turned into a full-fledged saga. This was no longer simply a night out. It was an event that had the entire city talking. When Kirk and Jock finally got up, they hadn't had another drink and hadn't needed to. Say much, the air between them was full of unspoken plans. Kirk looked toward the exit and said, "Let's go." Without hesitation, the Jock followed, without turning around and without exchanging words, just a silent assurance that this wasn't the end. Scrappy watched them go, his jaw clenched. One of his boys leaned in and whispered, but Scrappy shook his head and kept his eyes fixed on the door. "No," he murmured. "This ain't over outside the night air was. They think they're just going to walk out of here and come at me another day." Cold, but the tension remained high. A crowd had gathered around the valet, with individuals browsing through their phones and engaging in heated arguments. Kirk and Jock silently passed past them, dividing the crowd like ripples in water as they entered their cars and closed the doors. As they scrolled through the internet tempest, the glow from their phones softly illuminated the interior. Some of the comments were praise for Scrappy, while others called for Kirk and Jock to drop more receipts. Kirk's face hardened, and he added, "You know what we need to do, Jock." Tensions, boiling alliances, cracking a storm, developing behind the scenes, looked over his expression, unreadable. But he nodded, knowing that they didn't need to explain the club drama because the real conflict was about to happen. What happened in that club, in your opinion, is Kirk and Jock's side of a "is the narrative true?" Or is Scrappy simply the focus of some behind-the-scenes activity? Recently, let us know in the comments if you use power play. And believe me, you won't want to overlook what occurs next, such as this video's subscription, activate notifications because this is still ongoing.